The Galactic Council had existed for 12,000 years. In all that time, across 400 member species and 10,000 settled worlds, war had become something of a controlled sport. Civilizations arose, developed faster-than-light travel, discovered others, and eventually learned the truth that violence was inefficient. Resources could be negotiated, territories could be shared, conflicts were resolved through economic pressure, diplomatic maneuvering, and occasionally, ritualized combat between chosen champions. The Council maintained this peace not through military might, but through collective understanding. Every species that joined had already passed what they called the Great Filter, the point where a civilization either destroyed itself through unchecked aggression or evolved beyond such primitive impulses. War, as the ancient texts described it, was a relic of ignorant times, a phase every intelligent species eventually outgrew. Ambassador Threll of the Corvaxian Empire had heard the reports about the humans for 3 standard cycles before taking them seriously. His species had been part of the Council for 6,000 years, and in that time he had welcomed 42 new civilizations into the fold. The process was always the same. Initial contact, cultural exchange, demonstration of faster-than-light capability, assessment of technological development, and finally, integration into the galactic community. The humans should have been unremarkable. They came from a mid-sized yellow star in a quiet arm of the galaxy. Their homeworld, Earth, was pleasant enough. Abundant water, diverse ecosystems, a single moon that stabilized their climate. They had developed nuclear technology without destroying themselves, which was promising. Their faster-than-light drive was crude but functional, based on principles the Council had been using for millennia. By all measurements, they were ready to join. Threll stood in the observation deck of the Council station, watching the human delegation's ship approach. It was blocky and inelegant compared to the flowing designs preferred by most civilized species, clearly built for function over form. Beside him stood Counselor Mira, a Centauri, whose species had evolved from herd animals on a peaceful grassland world. They seemed nervous, Mira observed, her translator rendering her melodic language into galactic standard. Their communications have been very formal, very cautious. Most new species are overwhelmed, Threll replied. His own voice came out as a series of harmonic tones that the translator smoothly converted. Imagine discovering you're not alone, that there's an entire galaxy of civilizations waiting to meet you. I remember when my ancestors first made contact. The stories say half our population stopped working for a month, just staring at the sky. The human ship docked with practiced efficiency. Threll had to admit their pilots were skilled. Within moments, the delegation was being escorted through the crystalline corridors of the Council station. Threll and Mira made their way to the greeting chamber, a vast space designed to accommodate species of all sizes and environmental needs. The humans entered, and Threll studied them carefully. They were bipedal, like many species, with bilateral symmetry and forward-facing eyes, a predator's configuration, but so were the Corvaxians, and they'd been peaceful for thousands of years. The delegation consisted of 5 individuals, all wearing matching dark blue uniforms that seemed unnecessarily formal. The lead human stepped forward. She was shorter than Threll expected, with brown skin and dark hair pulled back in a severe style. Her eyes, though, Threll noticed her eyes immediately. They were constantly moving, assessing, cataloging every detail of the chamber. I am Secretary General Maria Santos of the United Earth Government, she said through her translation device. On behalf of humanity, I thank the Galactic Council for this historic meeting. The formalities proceeded smoothly. Threll explained the Council's purpose, its history, and the benefits of membership: increased trade, access to advanced technologies, protection under galactic law, and most importantly, the guarantee of peace. No council member had engaged in warfare for over 8,000 years. It simply wasn't done. Secretary General Santos listened carefully to everything, occasionally conferring quietly with her colleagues. When Threll finished, she asked her first question. "You mentioned protection under galactic law. Protection from what?" Threll's translator picked up an odd inflection in her voice. Not quite suspicion, but something close to it. "From misunderstandings, primarily," Counselor Mira answered. "The Council mediates disputes, ensures fair trade practices, and maintains order. Though I must say, actual threats are extraordinarily rare. Most species resolve their differences through dialogue." "And if dialogue fails," Santos pressed, "then we employ economic sanctions, trade restrictions, or, in extreme cases, social isolation," Threll explained. "No civilization wishes to be cut off from the galactic community. The social and economic costs are too high. It's quite effective." Something flickered across Santos's face, an expression Threll couldn't quite read. The humans had extensive facial muscles that seemed to convey subtle emotional information, and he wasn't yet familiar with their patterns. "I see," Santos said. "And your enforcement mechanisms? Military capabilities?" "We maintain a peacekeeping fleet," Mira said. "Small, symbolic really, ships designed for rescue operations, humanitarian aid, that sort of thing. We haven't needed actual warships in millennia." The human delegation exchanged glances. One of them, a tall male with graying hair, leaned close to Santos and whispered something. She nodded and turned back to the council representatives. "Forgive me, but I need to understand this clearly. You're saying that in 12,000 years with 400 member species, no one has ever broken this peace? No one has ever attacked another member of the council?" "There have been isolated incidents," Threll admitted. "Pirates, extremist groups, that sort of thing. But nation-state level warfare? Between member civilizations? Never. It would be pointless. What could possibly be gained that couldn't be acquired more efficiently through cooperation?" Santos was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice had changed, become harder somehow. "Secretary Threll, Counselor Mira, I need to share something about humanity, something I think you should understand before we proceed further." Threll felt a subtle unease creeping through him, though he couldn't identify why. The human's demeanor had shifted. She seemed less like a diplomat now and more like something else, something he had no reference for. "Please," he said, "we want to understand your species fully." Santos nodded to one of her colleagues, who activated a holographic display. Images began cycling through the air, images that made Threll's breathing tubes constrict. "This is Earth's history," Santos began. "What you're seeing are records from our past. This is what we call the First World War, a conflict that consumed our planet just over 200 years ago. 9 million military personnel died, 7 million civilians. It lasted 4 years. The images showed devastation on a scale Threll had only seen in archaeological records of pre-spaceflight civilizations. Cities in ruins, fields transformed into muddy wastelands, primitive weapons that seemed designed solely to cause maximum suffering. 21 years later, we did it again, Santos continued. The Second World War, 70 million dead, 6 years of fighting across every continent. We developed atomic weapons during that conflict and used them, twice, on civilian population centers. Counselor Mira made a sound of distress. Her species communicated emotion through subsonic frequencies, and Threll could feel her horror resonating through the floor. After that, we had what we called the Cold War, Santos said. 40 years where two massive alliances pointed enough nuclear weapons at each other to destroy all complex life on our planet several times over. We came within minutes of annihilation at least 3 times. But you survived, Threll said weakly. You moved past this phase, like all civilizations must. Santos's expression was grim. Did we? Secretary Threll, it's been less than a century since our last major global conflict. In galactic terms, we stopped killing each other yesterday. We unified not because we evolved beyond violence, but because we finally had something else to focus on. We found your beacon. We discovered we weren't alone. We turned our attention outward. She deactivated the holographic display and looked directly at Threll. We haven't outgrown war. We've just paused it. Every human military on Earth is still active, still training, still developing new weapon systems. We maintain standing armies numbering in the tens of millions. Our entire industrial base can be converted to weapons production in months. Why? Mira's voice was barely a whisper. Why would you maintain such capacity if you have no one to fight? The human's answer chilled Threll to his core. Because we've learned that peace is temporary, that violence is always an option someone will eventually choose. We've tried idealism, Counselor Mira. We've tried believing that reason and dialogue could solve all problems. And we've learned, at a cost of hundreds of millions of lives, that sometimes they can't. Threll struggled to process what he was hearing. But surely you understand that here, in the galactic community, such thinking is outdated. We've proven that civilization can exist without violence. 12,000 years of proof. Santos walked closer to him, and he noticed something else about those predators' eyes. They held neither malice nor aggression, just a deep, weary knowledge. Secretary Threll, I'm going to tell you something that I hope you never have to truly understand. Peace doesn't exist in a vacuum. Your council has maintained peace not because violence is impossible, but because no one has tested that peace. You've had 12,000 years of civilizations that all pass the same filter, that all think the same way, that all believe war is irrational. She paused, and Threll saw something in her expression that made his survival instincts flare, instincts he'd never needed to use, instincts so old his species had nearly bred them out. But humanity remembers. We remember what happens when reasonable people meet unreasonable ones, when diplomatic species encounter predatory ones, when civilization faces barbarism, and we've learned that the only guaranteed way to protect peace is to be ready for war. The chamber was silent. Threll could hear his own breathing, rapid and shallow. After a moment, he found his voice. Are you saying you won't join the council? No. Santos replied. We desperately want to join, to trade with you, learn from you, be part of something larger than ourselves. But we want you to understand what you're inviting into your community. We're not like you. We can't be. Our history won't let us. Threll exchanged a long look with Counselor Mira. They had protocols for this, for civilizations that hadn't fully evolved past their violent phase. Probationary membership, observation periods, gradual integration under strict guidelines. We'll need to discuss this with the full council, he said finally. Your application will need special consideration. Santos nodded as if she'd expected this. We understand. Take whatever time you need. But while you deliberate, I'd like to share one more thing. What is that? You mentioned pirates and extremist groups, threats that your peacekeeping fleet handles with rescue ships and humanitarian vessels. If you ever encounter a threat that can't be resolved with dialogue or economic pressure, if you ever face something that wants to take rather than trade, destroy rather than build, humanity will answer that call. She straightened. And for a moment, Threll saw something behind her eyes that made him understand why predators had those forward-facing eyes, why they evolved to track, to hunt, to fight. Because we know how to do something you've forgotten, something your civilization hasn't needed for 12,000 years. What's that? Mira asked. Secretary General Santos's answer was simple, delivered without pride or shame. Just fact. We know how to wage war. The human delegation left the chamber shortly after. Threll stood in the observation deck again, watching their blocky ship detach and begin its journey back to Earth. The council would meet within the day to discuss this unprecedented situation. Already he could feel the debates forming in his mind, the risks, the potential benefits, the philosophical implications of accepting a species that hadn't truly left violence behind. Beside him, Counselor Mira spoke softly. "Do you think they're dangerous?" Threll considered the question carefully. He thought about Santos's eyes, about the weariness in her voice, about the matter-of-fact way she'd described capabilities that horrified him. "I don't think they want to be," he said finally. "But I think they could be, if they needed to be. Should we be afraid of them?" It was a strange question. Fear was something Threll understood intellectually, from historical texts and ancient evolutionary biology, but he'd never actually felt it. No Korvaxian had, not in living memory. It was like asking if he should sprout wings. "I don't know," he admitted. "I don't think I even remember how." But as the human ship vanished into the black, Threll felt something stirring in the oldest parts of his brain. Some ancient response his ancestors had needed when they were prey, when danger was real and immediate. The feeling was unfamiliar, uncomfortable, almost alien. He would later realize it was the beginning of understanding, the first whisper of something the galaxy had forgotten. The humans called it fear. And in the cycles to come, as events unfolded in ways no one could predict, as the peaceful galaxy discovered that the universe held threats beyond their imagination, that feeling would become terribly, intimately familiar. But for now, Threll simply watched the darkness where the human ship had been and wondered what exactly they'd just invited into their ancient, peaceful community. He had a feeling, deep in those reawakening instincts, that the galaxy was about to change. He was right. The council's debate lasted 3 full cycles. Threll had never seen such division among the member species. The chamber, normally a place of calm deliberation, echoed with dozens of languages all speaking at once through translation systems struggling to keep pace. Representative Kalos of the Ninth Coalition argued for immediate acceptance. His species, the Drine, were traders who saw opportunity in everything. These humans have industrial capacity beyond most species at their development level. Their drive technology is primitive, yes, but their manufacturing capabilities are extraordinary. Imagine what they could contribute to the galactic economy. Counselor Ivan countered immediately. The Ivani were philosophers, deeply committed to the principle of nonviolence. We cannot compromise our fundamental values. 12,000 years of peace cannot be risked for economic gain. These humans glorify violence. They maintain weapons that could sterilize their own planet. How can we trust such a species? They were honest, Mira pointed out. Her voice carried clearly through the chaos. Secretary General Santos could have hidden their history, presented a sanitized version of their civilization. Instead, she showed us the truth. Doesn't that count for something? Supreme Arbiter Nexus, an ancient artificial intelligence that served as the Council's ultimate authority, brought order with a pulse of harmonic sound. The chamber fell silent immediately. Nexus had been created by the Council's founders 8,000 years ago. Designed to be impartial and wise, its crystalline form glowed softly at the center of the chamber. "The question before us," Nexus said, its voice somehow both mechanical and warm, "is not whether humanity is violent. This is established fact. The question is whether their violence is controlled, whether they are masters of their aggression or slaves to it." Threll found himself standing. "I propose probationary membership, limited access to Council technology and markets, observation by a dedicated team. If humanity can demonstrate peaceful coexistence for 50 standard cycles, we grant full membership." 50 cycles is nothing, Ivan protested. It took my species 300 cycles to fully integrate after contact. We need to see sustained commitment to peace. 50 cycles is more than enough to bankrupt their entire civilization, Kalos said dryly. If they're as aggressive as you fear, Ivan, they'll reveal themselves quickly. Violence is expensive. The vote was close, but Threll's proposal carried. Humanity would be granted provisional status. They could establish embassies, engage in limited trade, and participate in council meetings as observers. Full membership would be evaluated after the probationary period. Threll was assigned to lead the observation team. He wasn't sure if this was an honor or a punishment. The human embassy opened 6 months later on the Council's primary diplomatic station, Harmony. It was a massive structure, home to thousands of diplomatic staff from hundreds of species. The humans chose a modest suite in the outer ring, far from the prestigious central chambers. Threll met with Secretary General Santos regularly. She'd relocated to the embassy permanently, leaving Earth's governance to her successor. Over time, he began to understand the complexities of human culture. They were contradictory in ways that puzzled him. They could be incredibly generous, shipping food and medical supplies to struggling colonies without asking for payment. But they negotiated every trade deal with fierce intensity, never giving ground easily. They were fascinated by other species, eager to learn languages and customs, yet they maintained a certain distance, a wariness that never fully disappeared. "We trust, but verify," Santos explained during one of their dinners. She'd invited him to the human section of the embassy, where they'd recreated a restaurant from Earth. The food was strange. Humans apparently enjoyed combining dozens of ingredients in ways that seemed chaotic, but Threll found it surprisingly pleasant. "What does that mean?" he asked. "It means we want to believe the best in people, but we prepare for the worst." She sipped a dark liquid she called coffee. "It's not cynicism, Secretary Threll. It's realism. We've learned that good intentions don't always prevent bad outcomes. But doesn't such thinking become self-fulfilling? If you always prepare for conflict, doesn't that make conflict more likely?" Santos smiled sadly. "You'd think so, wouldn't you? But history shows the opposite. The civilizations on Earth that prepared for war often avoided it. The ones that believed their enemies would be reasonable, that everyone wanted peace as much as they did, those were the ones that got conquered." Threll wanted to argue, but he couldn't find the logical flaw in her reasoning. It simply contradicted everything he knew, everything the Council had proven for 12,000 years. The cycles passed. Humanity integrated slowly into the galactic community. Their traders were aggressive but honest. Their diplomats were skilled, if somewhat paranoid about security. They contributed to scientific research, particularly in materials science and weapons technology, though the Council limited their access to the most advanced offensive systems. Threll began to relax. Perhaps the humans would adapt. Perhaps exposure to galactic civilization would soften their military culture. He filed regular reports noting humanity's compliance with Council regulations and their positive contributions to the community. Then the Devourers arrived. The first warning came from a deep space monitoring station on the edge of Council space. A distress signal, badly garbled, speaking of ships unlike anything in the galactic database, of attacks without warning or communication, of entire colonies going silent. The Council dispatched a peacekeeping vessel to investigate. Standard procedure, probably just a technical malfunction or a misunderstanding. The ship was equipped with advanced sensors, communication arrays capable of translating any known language, and extensive first aid facilities. It never returned. A second ship was sent, and a third. None came back. 7 colonies in the Outer Rim went dark over the course of a month. The Council, for the first time in recorded history, faced a crisis it couldn't resolve through dialogue. Emergency session was called. Threll sat in his designated seat, watching species that had never known true fear struggle to process what was happening. The chamber's usual calm had evaporated, replaced by something close to panic. Nexus displayed what little data they had, scattered sensor readings from the lost colonies, images of ships, massive organic-looking things that seemed grown rather than built, analysis of debris that suggested biological components integrated with technology, and one final chilling piece of evidence, a recording from a colony in its last moments. The image showed creatures that defied easy description: chitinous armor, multiple limbs, eyes that seemed to hunger. They moved through the colony with terrible efficiency, collecting every living being they encountered, not killing, harvesting. The recording ended with screams. "We must find a way to communicate with them," Ivan insisted. "Every species can be reasoned with. We simply haven't found the right approach. We've tried every communication protocol in our database," Nexus replied. "They don't respond. They simply attack, harvest, and move on." "Then we need to try harder." Ivan's voice was desperate. "Violence cannot be the answer. It never is." Kalos spoke up, his trading instincts finally showing their sharp edge. "What do they want? Resources? Territory? Everything has a price. We can negotiate." "They want food," said a new voice. Everyone turned. Secretary General Santos stood in the observers' gallery. She wasn't supposed to speak during council sessions. Humans didn't have full membership. But no one objected. "I've reviewed all the data," Santos continued, walking down to the main floor. "These creatures are biological, not mechanical. They're not collecting resources or claiming territory. They're hunting. And we're the prey." "That's impossible," Ivan said. "No spacefaring species can be purely predatory. The energy requirements alone make it very efficient to harvest other civilizations," Santos interrupted. "They don't need to develop agriculture or industry. They just find species that have already done that work and take what they need. It's actually a brilliant strategy from an evolutionary standpoint." The chamber fell silent. Threll felt that strange sensation again, that ancient fear his ancestors had known. Santos's words made terrible sense. "What do we do?" Mira asked quietly. Santos looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of species from across the galaxy. When she spoke, her voice was steady but carried an undercurrent of something Threll had never heard from her before: anticipation. "You fight," Santos said simply. "You build weapons. You train soldiers. You take everything you know about physics and chemistry and biology, and you turn it toward one purpose: stopping these creatures from consuming your civilization." "We don't know how," Nexus admitted. The ancient AI's voice held something Threll never thought he'd hear from it: uncertainty. "Our peacekeeping fleet isn't designed for actual combat. We have no weapons beyond basic defensive systems. We have no military doctrine, no tactical training, no experience with warfare. That knowledge was deliberately erased from our databases thousands of years ago." "I know," Santos said. She pulled out a small device, and a holographic display sprang to life. Threll recognized it: a human military vessel, sleek, angular, covered in arrays he didn't understand. "But we do." The chamber erupted. Half the council members shouted objections while the other half simply stared in shock. Santos waited patiently for the noise to die down. "We told you," she said once she could be heard again. "We told you that we maintained our military capabilities, that we remembered how to wage war. You thought it was paranoia, a cultural flaw we'd eventually overcome." She gestured to the display. "This is why we stayed ready. Not because we wanted to fight, but because we knew that someday, somehow, there would be something that couldn't be reasoned with, something that only understood force." "You planned this," Ivan accused. "You knew this would happen." "No." Santos's voice was sharp. "We hoped we were wrong. We desperately wanted to be wrong. Do you have any idea how much resources we've poured into maintaining military readiness while the rest of you pursued art and philosophy and trade? How many times our own people questioned why we needed armies when the galaxy was at peace? She closed her eyes briefly, and Threll saw genuine pain on her face. But we were right. And I hate that we were right. Supreme Arbiter Nexus spoke. What are you proposing, Secretary General Santos? A joint defense force, Santos replied immediately. Humanity will provide military expertise, training, and weapon designs. You provide resources, industrial capacity, and coordination across Council space. We combine our strengths and build a fleet that can actually defend against these devourers. It would mean abandoning everything we've built, Mira said softly. 12,000 years of peace, of proving that civilization can exist without violence. Santos looked at her with something like sympathy. Counselor Mira, you proved that civilization can exist without violence when no one violent is around. That's not the same thing. Peace isn't the absence of capacity for violence. It's the choice not to use that capacity. You never made that choice. You just forgot the option existed. She turned to address the full council. These devourers are coming. They've already taken 7 of your colonies. They'll take more. They'll keep coming until they've harvested everything they can reach. You can maintain your ideological purity and die, or you can accept that sometimes survival requires getting your hands dirty. Threll stood. His legs felt weak, but he forced himself to remain upright. I recommend we accept humanity's offer. Immediately. Seconded, Kalos said. The debate that followed was bitter. Some species threatened to leave the council rather than participate in warfare. Others argued that this was exactly the kind of threat the council was supposed to protect against. A few questioned whether the devourers were really as dangerous as the humans claimed. Perhaps this was all an elaborate scheme to gain more power. That argument died when another 3 colonies went silent during the debate. The vote was called. It passed, barely. The council would work with humanity to build a defense force. Species that objected were allowed to abstain, but they couldn't prevent the action. Santos nodded once, accepting the decision without triumphalism. We'll need access to your industrial facilities, full databases on your technology and resources, and authority to establish training centers across council space. Granted, Nexus said. What else? Santos's expression hardened. Time. These devourers are moving fast. Every day we delay, more people die. We need to move faster than you've ever moved before. No committees, no extended deliberations. Military decisions need to be made quickly, by people who understand warfare. You're asking us to give you extraordinary authority, Ivan observed coldly. I'm asking you to let us save your civilization, Santos replied. But yes, that requires trust. The same trust we extended to you when we first made contact. We showed you our violent history and asked you to believe we could be more than that. Now I'm asking you to believe that we'll use our capability for violence to protect, not dominate. Threll spoke before anyone else could object. I trust them. I've worked with Secretary General Santos for 2 cycles. I've come to know humanity. They're aggressive, yes, military-minded, absolutely, but they're also honorable. They keep their word. Mira stood as well. I agree. I recommend we grant the humans emergency authority to coordinate our defense. The final vote was unanimous among those species that hadn't abstained. Humanity was given unprecedented power to mobilize council resources for war. Santos immediately opened a communications channel to Earth. Threll watched as she spoke rapidly in human languages he didn't understand, issuing orders that would reshape the galaxy. Within hours, human military advisors were boarding ships bound for every major council facility. Defense contracts were being negotiated with hundreds of industrial worlds. Training manuals were being translated into thousands of languages. Threll stood beside Santos as she coordinated the massive undertaking, marveling at the speed and efficiency of human military logistics. "How long?" he asked. "How long until we can mount a defense?" Santos didn't look away from her displays. "To build a fleet that can match the Devourers, 6 months minimum, assuming we can convert enough industrial capacity to train your people to actually fight? That's harder. You're asking species that have never known violence to suddenly become warriors. Can it be done?" She finally looked at him, and Threll saw something in her eyes he'd never seen before. Not fear. Humans seem to accept fear as a natural state. This was something else. Determination. The absolute certainty of someone who would do whatever was necessary. "It has to be," Santos said, "because the alternative is extinction." The council chamber slowly emptied as species returned to their home worlds to begin mobilization. Threll remained, looking out at the stars. Somewhere out there, the Devourers were moving closer. Somewhere out there, peaceful colonies were becoming harvesting grounds. The galaxy was at war. They just didn't know how to fight it yet. But humanity did. And in the coming months, as species that had forgotten violence learned to remember it, as peaceful traders became soldiers and philosophers learned tactics, the galaxy would discover something the humans had always known. That peace is precious because war is terrible. That civilization is fragile because barbarism is always waiting. And that sometimes the only way to preserve what you love is to be willing to destroy what threatens it. The Council had spent 12,000 years building a galaxy without fear. Now humanity would teach them why fear existed in the first place, and why, sometimes, it was the only thing that kept you alive. The transformation of the Galactic Council's industrial centers began within days. Threll watched from the observation deck of the newly established Military Coordination Center as the first human advisors arrived at the manufacturing facilities on Cora Prime. The Korans were master builders, their automated factories capable of producing anything from medical equipment to luxury goods with astounding precision. Now those factories were being retooled for war. Commander Sarah Chen, the human military officer assigned to oversee Cora Prime's conversion, moved through the facilities with swift efficiency. Threll had requested permission to shadow her, wanting to understand how humanity approached warfare on an industrial scale. "Your manufacturing capabilities are incredible," Chen said, examining a fabrication unit that could assemble complex machinery at the molecular level. "But you've been building the wrong things." "What do you mean?" Threll asked. "We produce everything the Council needs." Chen pulled up schematics on her portable display. "You build things that last forever. That's great for peace, terrible for war. In combat, equipment gets destroyed. We need volume, not longevity. We need weapons that can be manufactured quickly, deployed rapidly, and replaced when they're lost." She started adjusting parameters on the manufacturing systems. Threll watched as decades of careful production protocols were overwritten with new designs. Sleeker, simpler, more efficient for their deadly purpose. "This feels wrong," he admitted. "We've spent thousands of years moving away from such thinking." Chen looked at him, and her expression softened slightly. "I know. My grandmother was a pacifist. She protested every military action Earth took for 50 years. She believed war was always wrong, always avoidable. Then raiders attacked her colony." Chen's voice remained steady, but Threll heard the pain underneath. "She survived because our military arrived in time. After that, she said something I've never forgotten. I still believe war is wrong, but I've learned that being right doesn't stop bullets." The first weapons came off the production lines 3 days later. Plasma cannons, based on energy weapons the Council had used for mining and construction, but modified for combat. Missile systems loaded with warheads that could crack apart the organic hulls of Devourer ships. Point defense systems to protect against the acid projectiles the enemy used. But hardware was only part of the solution. The Council needed soldiers, and that proved far more difficult than anyone anticipated. Threll attended the first training session at the military academy humanity had established on Harmony Station. 200 volunteers from 30 different species filled the training ground, a vast space usually used for cultural exhibitions, now converted into an obstacle course. General Marcus Webb stood before them, a tall human with gray hair and the bearing of someone who'd spent his entire life in uniform. He spoke clearly, his translator working flawlessly. "You are here because your civilizations are facing extinction. The Devourers don't negotiate. They don't retreat. They don't accept surrender. They consume everything in their path. Your only chance of survival is to fight, and fighting is what I'm going to teach you." The volunteers shifted nervously. Threll recognized many of them. Diplomats, traders, scientists, people who had chosen careers specifically because they avoided conflict. "I need to be honest with you," Webb continued. "Many of you will fail this training, not because you're weak or stupid, but because your entire civilization has been structured around avoiding what we're asking you to do. You've been raised to negotiate, to compromise, to find peaceful solutions. Those are good instincts for peace. They'll get you killed in war." A young Drin raised a manipulator appendage. "General Webb, what if we're captured? Should we attempt to communicate with our captors, establish rapport?" "You won't be captured," Webb interrupted. "The Devourers don't take prisoners. They harvest. If they get you, you're food. There is no negotiation, no rapport, no peaceful resolution. The only question is whether you kill them before they kill you." The bluntness shocked the room into silence. Threll saw several volunteers quietly leave. Webb didn't try to stop them. "Anyone else want to go?" the general asked. "No shame in it. Not everyone is meant to be a soldier. But if you stay, understand this. I'm going to teach you things that will horrify you. I'm going to make you practice violence until it becomes instinct. I'm going to strip away the civilized person you've spent your life becoming and find the warrior underneath. It's going to be brutal, it's going to be traumatic, and some of you will never be the same." He paused, looking across the diverse group of species before him. "But you'll be alive. And so will your families, your worlds, your civilization. That's what we're fighting for." The training began. Threll observed it all, documenting everything for the Council records. He watched as Webb taught species that had never held a weapon how to aim, fire, and reload under pressure. He saw volunteers learn to move as units, covering each other's weaknesses. He witnessed the careful psychological work as human instructors helped peaceful species overcome their instinctive aversion to violence. It was slow, painful progress. A Centauri volunteer broke down crying after successfully completing a combat simulation, horrified by what they'd done even to holographic enemies. A Corvaxian froze in the middle of an exercise, unable to pull the trigger even when instructed. A Yavani refused to continue after the first week, saying they'd rather die than become what war demanded. But others adapted. They learned. They became something their species hadn't seen in millennia. They became soldiers. Threll met regularly with Santos to review progress. The embassy had become the de facto military headquarters for the Council's defense efforts, and the human section was a constant hive of activity. "We're 3 months into conversion," Santos said, pulling up status reports. "We have 40 ships combat ready, another 100 in various stages of completion. 7,000 trained soldiers with 20,000 more in training. Industrial output is increasing by 12% each week." "Is it enough?" Threll asked. Santos's expression was grim. "Not yet. Intelligence estimates the Devourer fleet at over 200 ships. They've harvested 16 colonies now. The good news is they seem to be consolidating their gains rather than pushing deeper into Council space. We have time, but not much. Why are they waiting? Best guess? They're processing what they've already taken, converting biomass into more Devourers, more ships. They're not just an invasion force, they're a civilization. They need time to digest their conquests before moving on. Threll felt his breathing tubes constrict at the clinical description of whole populations being consumed. How do your people deal with this knowledge? That such horrors exist? Santos was quiet for a moment. We remember that we've created similar horrors ourselves. Every human in this station knows our history. We know what we're capable of when we lose control, when we dehumanize our enemies, when we let rage and fear drive our decisions. That's why our military has strict rules of engagement, ethical protocols, oversight mechanisms. We learned the hard way that becoming monsters to fight monsters leaves you with no victory worth having. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the stars. But we also learned that refusing to fight monsters at all just means they win unopposed. It's a balance, Secretary Threll. One we've been trying to maintain for centuries. The first engagement came in the 4th month. The Devourers attacked the mining colony on Theta Sigma 9, a rich asteroid field that supplied rare elements to half the Council's industrial base. They'd hit 5 similar targets before, always with the same result: total harvesting, complete loss. This time, the Council was ready. The defense fleet jumped into the system within an hour of the distress signal. Threll was aboard the flagship, the Harmony's Shield, a massive vessel that represented everything humanity and the Council had built together. Council technology providing shields and engines, human weapons bristling from every surface, and a crew drawn from dozens of species. Captain Li Wei commanded the flagship. She was young for a human in such a position, but her tactical brilliance was undeniable. General Webb had personally recommended her for the role. Devourers detected, the sensor officer announced. 12 ships, heavy class. They're in standard harvesting formation around the colony. Weapons ready, Li Wei ordered. All ships, tight formation. Don't give them room to flank us. Remember your training. Threll could feel the tension on the bridge. This wasn't a simulation. The ships they were about to fight were real. The weapons were live. And if they failed, thousands of beings in the colony below would be consumed. The Devourer ships turned to face them. Threll saw them on the main display, massive, writhing things that seemed to pulse with malevolent life. They launched their first volley, streams of corrosive biomatter that ate through conventional hulls in seconds. "Evasive maneuvers," Li Wei commanded. "Return fire, all batteries." The Harmony's Shield's plasma cannons opened up, brilliant streams of superheated energy lancing across space. They struck the lead Devourer ship, burning through its organic armor. The creature, Threll couldn't think of it as just a ship, writhed in what might have been pain. But it didn't stop. None of them did. They kept coming, absorbing damage that would have crippled any Council vessel, regenerating almost as fast as they were hurt. "They're adapting to our weapons," the tactical officer reported. "Plasma efficiency dropping by 15%. "Switch to kinetic rounds," Li Wei ordered without hesitation. "Missiles, full spread. We need to overwhelm their regeneration." The battle became chaos. Ships on both sides exchanged fire at distances that made the engagement seem almost elegant. But Threll knew the reality was anything but. Each burst of light represented weapons designed to kill. Each explosion meant lives lost. The Council ships fought with a coordination they'd never shown before. The Drine vessels used their superior speed to harry the Devourers from multiple angles. The Korvaxian heavy cruisers formed a defensive line, their shields protecting smaller ships as they maneuvered. The Centauri, despite their philosophical objections to violence, proved surprisingly effective at targeting enemy weak points with precise fire. But the Devourers were relentless. They moved with a unity that suggested a hive intelligence, coordinating their attacks perfectly. When one was damaged, the others covered its retreat while it regenerated. When they found an opening in the Council's formation, they exploited it immediately. "We've lost the traitor's dream," the communications officer reported. The Eternal Light is heavily damaged. Requesting permission to withdraw. Denied, Li Wei said coldly. If we break formation now, they'll pick us off individually. All ships maintain position. Focus fire on the damaged vessels. Don't let them regenerate. Threll wanted to object. The Eternal Light's crew were Yavani, philosophers and artists who had overcome everything their culture taught them to be here. Asking them to fight to the death seemed cruel beyond measure. But he remembered what Santos had said. Sometimes survival requires getting your hands dirty. Sometimes the only choice is between dying with your principles intact or living with the knowledge that you did what was necessary. The concentrated fire worked. The first Devourer ship exploded in a burst of organic matter and twisted metal. Then a second. The Hive intelligence adapted, trying new tactics, but Li Wei countered each one. She was thinking 3 moves ahead, predicting their responses and positioning the fleet accordingly. The Eternal Light took another hit, their shields collapsing. Threll saw the ship begin to break apart. "Helm, emergency jump," Li Wei ordered. "Put us between the Eternal Light and the enemy, now!" The Harmony's shield appeared directly in the path of the Devourer's next attack. The biomatter struck their shields, eating through the outer layers, but giving the Eternal Light time to retreat. The damaged ship jumped away, its crew saved, but at the cost of the flagship's shield integrity. "Multiple breaches on decks 7 through 12, Damage Control reported. Hull integrity at 60%. "Ignore it," Li Wei snapped. "Weapons. Keep firing. We're not done yet." The battle raged for 3 more hours. By the end, 5 Devourer ships were destroyed, 4 had retreated, and 3 remained locked in combat. The Council fleet had lost 4 ships entirely, and another 9 were too damaged to continue fighting. But they'd won. The colony was saved. Threll stood in the medical bay afterward, watching the wounded being treated. Species from across the Council, all injured in the same battle, all having faced the same enemy. A young Drin soldier was being treated for acid burns, joking weakly with the Korvaxian medic who was carefully neutralizing the corrosive agent. "We did it," Mira said softly, appearing beside him. Her usually pristine fur was matted with grime and stress. She'd been aboard one of the damaged ships. "We actually fought them and won." "At what cost?" Threll gestured to the rows of injured, to the empty spaces where the dead should be. "Was this worth it?" "Yes," said a voice behind them. Santos stood in the doorway, looking as exhausted as Threll felt. "Because if we'd let them take this colony, next month they'd have taken another, and another, until there was nothing left to save." She walked to a window overlooking the colony below. Lights were coming back on as the colonists emerged from their shelters. Thousands of beings who would have been harvested if the fleet hadn't arrived in time. "This is what war is," Santos said. "Not glory or heroism or any of the sanitized versions civilizations tell themselves. It's good people dying to protect others. It's making impossible choices and living with the consequences. It's sacrificing your peace of mind, your innocence, maybe your life, so that others don't have to." She turned to face them both. "Humanity learned this lesson over millennia. We fought so many wars, lost so many people, made so many mistakes, and we learned that the only thing worse than being willing to fight is being unable to when you need to." Over the next several months, the pattern repeated. The Devourers would attack, and the Council fleet would respond. Not every battle was a victory. Some colonies were lost despite their best efforts. Some ships didn't return. The casualty lists grew longer. But the Council learned. Their tactics improved. Their soldiers became veterans. Species that had never known war developed military traditions, ceremonies to honor the fallen, ways to process the trauma of violence. The galaxy was changing, adapting, becoming something new. The decisive battle came 8 months after the first Devourer attack. Intelligence finally located the enemy's primary hive, a massive structure in deep space. Surrounded by hundreds of ships and defended by weapons platforms that made their previous encounters look like skirmishes. The Council assembled its entire fleet, every combat-capable ship, every trained soldier, every weapon they'd managed to produce. It wasn't enough to match the Devourers numerically, but it was everything they had. Threll stood on the bridge of the Harmony's shield once more. The ship had been repaired and upgraded 3 times since that first battle. Scars from combat marked its hull, repairs that were left visible deliberately. The humans said it was important to remember the cost of victory. Final approach in 10 minutes, Captain Li Wei announced. Around them, 200 ships held formation. Vessels from every member species, all coordinating perfectly after months of training and combat. Santos stood beside Threll. She'd insisted on being present for this battle despite having no official military role. "No matter what happens today," she said quietly, "you should be proud. You've accomplished something incredible." "What's that?" Threll asked. "You learned that peace isn't the same as pacifism, that protecting what you love sometimes requires doing things you hate, that civilization isn't measured by never falling, but by always getting back up." She smiled slightly. "You learned what humanity spent 10,000 years figuring out, and you did it in less than a year." "We had a good teacher," Mira said from her position at the communication station. She'd requested a posting on the flagship after recovering from her injuries. The Devourer hive came into view. It was vast beyond comprehension, a structure that dwarfed any space station the Council had ever built. And surrounding it, waiting, was the enemy fleet. "All ships," Li Wei broadcast across the entire force. "This is it. Everything we fought for comes down to the next few hours. Remember your training. Trust your crews. Fight for each other and we'll all get home." She took a breath, and Threll heard the steel in her voice. "Engage the enemy." The battle was like nothing the galaxy had ever seen. Ships maneuvered in 3 dimensions, weapons fire crisscrossing space in deadly patterns. The Devourers fought with the desperation of a species facing extinction, throwing everything they had at the Council fleet. But they were facing something they'd never encountered before, a galaxy that remembered how to fight back. The Drine ships danced through enemy fire, their pilots executing maneuvers that should have been impossible. The Corvaxian vessels stood like mountains, absorbing punishment and returning it tenfold. The Centauri proved that precision could overcome brute force, picking off enemy ships with surgical accuracy. And the human vessels led from the front, their commanders making split-second decisions that turned the tide again and again. Threll watched as the tactical display filled with markers showing destroyed ships, red for Council losses, green for Devourer casualties. The colors mixed and swirled as the battle raged. It was beautiful in a terrible way, this dance of death played out across the cosmos. A Devourer ship broke through the line and headed straight for the Harmony's shield. Li Wei didn't flinch. "All batteries, focus fire! Helm, hold course! Let them come!" The enemy vessel launched its attack, biomatter streaming toward them. The shields held, barely. Return fire struck the Devourer multiple times, and Threll saw it begin to break apart. But it kept coming, using its last moments to try to take the flagship with it. "It's going to ram us," the tactical officer reported. "Missiles," Li Wei ordered. "Point-blank range. Fire everything." The Harmony's shield launched its entire payload directly into the approaching Devourer. The explosion was massive, consuming the enemy vessel entirely. The shock wave struck the flagship, rattling every system, but the shields held. Across the battlefield, similar scenes played out. Council ships fought with a ferocity that would have been unimaginable a year ago. They weren't just defending colonies anymore. They were fighting for the right to exist, for the future of galactic civilization, for everything 12,000 years of peace had built. The turning point came when a team of Centauri bombers, escorted by human fighters, managed to reach the hive structure itself. They targeted what intelligence suggested was the central processing organ, the hive mind, that coordinated all devourer activities. The weapons struck true. The massive structure shuddered, and across the battlefield, the devourer ships faltered. Their perfect coordination broke down. Ships that had been working in concert suddenly operated independently, making mistakes, leaving openings. The Council fleet pressed their advantage. One by one, the devourer ships were destroyed or driven off. The hive structure began to collapse, its biological systems failing catastrophically. "They're retreating," Mira reported. "All remaining enemy vessels are jumping away." Li Wei didn't celebrate. "Pursuit course, don't let them regroup." But Santos put a hand on her arm. "Let them go, Captain. They'll just attack again. We should finish this." "No," Santos said firmly. "We've destroyed their hive, scattered their fleet. They're no longer an existential threat. If we pursue now, if we hunt down every last one of them, we become what they are, a force of extinction." She looked around the bridge. "We fought because we had to. We killed because they left us no choice. But we don't have to make them extinct. Let them flee to whatever corner of the galaxy they came from. Let them remember that the Council isn't prey. We're protectors." "There's a difference." Li Wei hesitated, then nodded slowly. "All ships, stand down. Let them go." The battle was over. The Council had won. The cost had been staggering. 40 ships destroyed, 15,000 dead, countless more wounded, physically and psychologically, entire civilizations traumatized by their first experience with real warfare. But they'd survived. The devourers were broken, scattered, no longer a threat to galactic civilization. And the Council had learned something it could never unlearn. The ceremony took place 3 months later in the grand chamber where the Council had first debated humanity's membership. Every species was represented. Thousands of beings gathered to honor the dead and celebrate the living. Supreme Arbiter Nexus spoke first. 12,000 years ago, our ancestors established the Galactic Council on a principle: that civilization could exist without violence. For all that time, we believed we had evolved beyond war. We were wrong. The AI's voice carried through the chamber. We had not evolved beyond war. We had simply been fortunate enough never to need it. When that need arose, we were unprepared. We would have been destroyed if not for one species who remembered what we had forgotten. Nexus turned its crystalline form toward the human delegation. Humanity taught us that peace is not the absence of capacity for violence, but the choice not to use that capacity. They showed us that being willing to fight doesn't make you barbaric. Refusing to protect what you love does. They gave us back something we didn't know we'd lost, the ability to defend ourselves. Santos stood, walking to the center of the chamber. "We're honored to have helped," she said simply. "But understand this. The victory was yours, not ours. You were the ones who chose to fight despite everything your culture taught you. You were the ones who overcame thousands of years of peaceful instincts to become warriors. You were the ones who suffered and died and kept fighting anyway." She gestured to the assembled representatives. "Humanity showed you how to wage war. But you showed us something equally important, that a civilization can pick up weapons without losing its soul, that you can become warriors without becoming warmongers, that you can do terrible, necessary things and still remain fundamentally good." Threll stood and walked forward. As the leader of the observation team that had first evaluated humanity, he'd been asked to make the final recommendation on their membership status. "When humanity first came before this council," he said, "we feared them. We saw their capacity for violence and worried they would bring war to our peaceful galaxy. We were right to fear, but wrong about why." He looked at Santos, at the human delegation, at the military advisors who'd trained the Council's soldiers. Humanity didn't bring war to us. War came on its own, as it always does eventually. What humanity brought was the knowledge of how to survive it, the strength to face it, the courage to do what was necessary. He turned to address Nexus and the full Council. I recommend that humanity be granted full membership in the Galactic Council, not probationary, not limited, full membership with all rights and responsibilities, because they've earned it not through compliance or patience, but through sacrifice. They bled for worlds that weren't their own. They fought for species they barely knew. They kept us alive. The vote was unanimous. For the first time in Council history, a species was accepted not despite their capacity for violence, but because of it. As the ceremony concluded and representatives began to depart, Threll found himself standing with Santos and Mira looking out at the stars. "What happens now?" Mira asked. "We've built armies, trained soldiers, created weapons. Do we just keep them?" Santos nodded. "Yes, you maintain military readiness. You train new soldiers to replace the old. You continue developing better weapons and tactics, because the Devourers might return, or something else might come. The galaxy is vast, and there's no guarantee we've seen all its threats." "But we're at peace now," Mira protested. "Why continue preparing for war?" "Because that's what keeps the peace," Threll said, finally understanding. "The Devourers attacked us because they thought we were helpless. They were right. We were. If we become helpless again, something else will notice. Someone else will attack." Santos smiled slightly. "Now you're thinking like a human. Welcome to the burden we've carried for millennia. The knowledge that peace is fragile, that it must be defended, that the price of civilization is eternal vigilance." She looked out at the stars, at the vast galaxy full of wonders and horrors in equal measure. "Your 12,000 years of peace weren't wasted. You built something beautiful, something worth protecting. You just forgot that beauty requires guardians. Now you remember. The galaxy is better for it." Threll thought about everything that had changed in the past year. The innocence lost, the violence learned, the transformation of peaceful species into warriors. But he also thought about the colonies saved, the civilizations preserved, the future secured. "We've changed," he said quietly. "We can never go back to what we were." "No," Santos agreed. "But you can go forward. Build a galaxy that remembers both the value of peace and the cost of war. Create a civilization that's wise enough to avoid violence whenever possible, but strong enough to survive when it's necessary. That's the balance humanity has been trying to achieve for centuries. Maybe together, we can finally get it right." Below them, in the training centers that still operated, new recruits continued their exercises. Species from across the galaxy learning tactics and strategy and combat. Not because they wanted war, but because they refused to be victims. The galaxy had learned to fear, and in learning fear, they'd learned something equally important. They'd learned courage, the kind of courage that faces the darkness and stands firm, that protects the innocent even at cost to itself, that chooses to fight not because violence is glorious, but because what you're protecting is precious. Humanity had taught the galaxy this lesson with patience and sacrifice. They'd shown that being civilized doesn't mean being weak, that peace isn't surrender, that sometimes the most peaceful choice is to be capable of war, but wise enough to avoid it. And as the three of them stood watching the stars, representing three species that had learned to trust each other through fire and blood, Threll realized something profound. They had never known fear until humanity came, but now that they did, now that they understood what it meant to be afraid and face that fear anyway, they were finally, truly free. Because fear that can be faced isn't weakness, it's wisdom. And a galaxy that remembers how to fight is a galaxy that can choose peace with eyes wide open, knowing the alternative and rejecting it anyway. That was the greatest gift humanity had given them. Not weapons or tactics or military strength, but the freedom to choose peace from a position of strength rather than helplessness. And that made all the difference.